Today we're going to talk about the beginning of the Civil War and some of the important strategies that the North or the Union were using and the important strategies of the Confederacy or the South. A military strategy is just like a plan for victory. It's what each side was going to do in order to try and win the war. What you're looking at now is a map of the United States and what it would have looked like during the Civil War. The states that are in the dark red color would have been the Confederacy or the South. Those are the states that left the United States. They revolted, that's why they were called rebels, and they decided to form their own country. The states that are in the dark blue color are the states that remained loyal to the United States of America. They were called the Union, as in the United States. They were trying to stay united together. Notice also two states that we haven't talked about yet while we were talking about westward expansion. Kansas, just to the west of Missouri, and Nevada both came in during the Civil War. Both those states were admitted as free states. One of the reasons that the Union wanted to admit those was so that when the Civil War was over, they would have two more free states to kind of help them put the country back together again. The other thing that you notice too is the 4 or 5 states there that are the light blue color. That light blue color, those states are the border states, including Missouri. They also include Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. Those states are the border states. They still had slavery allowed in them, but they remained loyal to the United States. They did not want to leave and join the Confederacy and revolt against the United States government. West Virginia actually was part of Virginia when Virginia left and seceded and joined the Confederacy, but they decided that they did not want to join the Confederacy. Most of the people there did not own slaves, so they remained loyal to the Union, to the United States of America, and they were admitted as a free state, the state of West Virginia. So you have those 5 free border states there in light blue. The dark blue is the Union or the North, and the red color is the Confederacy or the South. Now, when the Civil War first started, both sides thought that it was going to be a very quick war. They thought it was going to be an easy war. They didn't think it was going to take very long. This was probably a mistake by both of them. Both sides felt very strongly about their opinion. The North was trying to hold the country together, trying to defend the Constitution, and they viewed the South as rebels or traitors. They had turned their back on their country and revolted against the United States government. The Confederacy thought of this as a revolution. They were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting against a government that had denied them their rights, and they felt like they had a right to leave. They thought the Constitution was just an agreement between the states, and that at any point the states could leave if they wanted to, and in this case they wanted to. So they felt like the North should let them go, and they didn't understand what the North was so angry about. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the specific strategies used by the Union Army to try to win the Civil War. The Union Army, of course, is led by President Abraham Lincoln. Many people worried that Lincoln wasn't a strong enough military leader to serve as commander-in-chief during the Civil War. He had no military background. He had never served in the Army. He did not go to military school. So a lot of people doubted his ability to lead a military. Lincoln was very strong-willed, though. He was very committed to proving everybody wrong and proving that he was a capable leader and able to keep the Union together. Even though he didn't have much background in military, though, Lincoln did prove that he was a very good war planner and a strong leader. He was very patient, and a lot of people really appreciated his sense of humor. Whenever people would criticize him, he could just kind of smile and shrug it off. At one point, his own Secretary of War called him a fool, and Lincoln kind of laughed and said, well, if he said that I was a fool, then I must be one, because he's generally right and he always says what he thinks. So Lincoln was really good at being able to kind of shrug off people who criticized him, and he proved to be really, really good at military planning. When the war first starts, the first person that Abraham Lincoln asked to be the commanding general of the Union Army was Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was from Virginia, and he basically waits to see what Virginia is going to do. After the attacks on Fort Sumter, Virginia votes. They decide to leave and join the Confederacy, so Robert E. Lee goes with them. In fact, so do most of the other really good generals in the United States Army. They leave and join the Confederacy. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Lincoln is forced to turn to a guy named George McClellan. McClellan wasn't nearly as experienced as Robert E. Lee. He was very unproven, and a lot of people kind of doubted how well he would do leading the Union Army. Of course, Abraham Lincoln and the rest of the Union, their main goal is just to keep the Union together.
They weren't fighting to end slavery yet. There were still a lot of people who were racist in the North. They didn't necessarily agree with slavery, but they weren't willing to fight and lose their lives to end it. Plus, Lincoln at this point was still worried about those border states. He doesn't want to make it about slavery because he's afraid those border states will leave and join the South. So right now, the whole purpose of the war is just keep the Union together. He was afraid that if they were allowed the South to leave, then at other points other states may leave, and that the United States could eventually break apart into a lot of little countries or just individual states. He didn't want that to happen. He wanted the United States to be able to stay together, stay strong. Now, as far as the actual Union strategy on how they were going to win the war, they were going to have to be very aggressive. They couldn't just allow the South to just be down there by itself. They were going to have to go down there and conquer it. Otherwise, the South gets what they want, which is to be left alone and become their own country. So they were going to have to be aggressive, and they were going to have to go conquer the South. Now, one of the ways that they were going to do that becomes known as the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan is proposed by one of Lincoln's top generals, General Winfield Scott. And he proposes that the United States, the Union, is going to use their Navy. Most of the Navy stayed with the Union during the war. The South had very few naval ships or naval commanders. General Scott's plan is that if they can make sure that nothing is going in or out of the South, like supplies or trade coming from Europe, it'll make it easier for the Union to win the war. Some historians argue about how effective it really was. The naval blockade is able to sink about 1,500 ships during the course of the war, except it's estimated that roughly 4 out of every 5 ships coming in or out of the South is able to beat the blockade. There's just not enough ships to cover every square inch of the ocean out there, so a lot of the ships are still able to trade. Now, the next part of the Union strategy is actually a part of the Anaconda Plan, and that involves the Mississippi River. The United States is hoping to cut off the South. They can cut off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest of the South by controlling the Mississippi River with their powerful navy. This keeps supplies from crossing the Mississippi River. It cuts the South in half, and it allows them to kind of focus on one side or the other, mainly the eastern part, the parts on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. The last part of the Union strategy to win the Civil War is to capture Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia becomes the capital of the Confederacy. It's the seat of their government. So whenever you're trying to win a war, you always want to capture the other country's capital, and that becomes a part of the Union strategy. Now let's talk a little bit about the battle strategies for the South and what the Confederacy was going to do to try to win the Civil War. You see the Confederate flag there. Sometimes it's also called the rebel flag because the South was being rebels. They were rebelling or revolting against the United States government. The leader of the Confederate Army was their president, Jefferson Davis. Davis served as a military officer during the Mexican-American War. He had gone to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was very well respected. In fact, a lot of Southern politicians had commented that if it were up to him, he would have probably rather been a general in the war rather than serving as the president. He had also served as a Secretary of War under the 14th President, Franklin Pierce. So Jefferson Davis definitely knew his stuff as far as military leader was concerned. Some people in the South, though, did feel like Jefferson Davis maybe was a little bit too wrapped up in the actual military decisions. Maybe he should have let some of those military decisions be made by his generals, and he could have been more worried about the politics or the leadership, the economy, things like that of the South. But Jefferson Davis was definitely a good military leader, but he probably spent a little bit too much time worrying about the little minor details. He was probably a little too hands-on as a commander-in-chief. Now, as far as the Southern goals for the war, remember the Confederacy was fighting a revolutionary war. They were fighting this war in an attempt to become their own country. They're fighting it for their freedom. At this point, they're furious with Lincoln. They're furious with the North. They feel like their voices aren't being heard, that the North just put an abolitionist in the White House. So they've pretty much given up on trying to work out their differences. They're tired of the compromises. And they feel like they have a right to leave the Union. They think that the Constitution is just an agreement between states. They should be allowed to leave if they want to. Now, as far as the Confederate strategy on how they're going to win the war, their main goal is play defense. If you're trying to win a Revolutionary War, they go with a lot of the same kind of strategy that George Washington used when they were trying to beat the British. They don't have to be. They don't have to go conquer the North. They don't have to go win any new land or anything like that. All they really have to do, they just want to be left alone. So all they have to really do is wait for the North to get tired of fighting them and eventually allow them to leave. That's really their plan. This doesn't really work out for them, obviously, but part of what goes on with the South is they have a lot of Southern pride, and a lot of the people in the South are so angry with the North that they're not happy with Jefferson Davis's plan to just play defense and kind of move around and just try to avoid any major battles. That worked for George Washington, but in the South, they're angry. They want to go conquer the North. A lot of the citizens do. So Jefferson Davis kind of gets himself stuck, and he ends up their strategy ends up being what he calls offensive defense. They just kind of they try to do just enough attacking that the North has to worry about it, but for the most part, they're just going to wait for the North to lose interest in fighting. The second thing that they're doing is they're trying to convince the European countries like Britain and France to come and support them. The South has always had a great relationship with Britain and France because of their cotton trade. Plus, remember we talked about the cottonocracy. A lot of the really rich and wealthy people were making a lot of decisions in the South, and that's very similar to the British monarchy or the French monarchy that had taken over after Napoleon lost control. So a lot of the European countries get along well with the South. The problem that the Confederates have is that in Europe, slavery's been outlawed for a long time by now. So a lot of the European countries can't really be seen supporting a country that still has slavery. They don't like that at all. But remember, Lincoln was still saying it's not about slavery. We're not fighting to free the slaves. And as long as he's saying that, that means that Europe may still think about getting involved in the war in order to support the South and to support their cotton trade and the cottonocracy, or the rich, wealthy people who were really making a lot of the decisions in the South.
Okay, let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each side going into the Civil War. In the North had a much larger population, about 4 times as many freed men as in the South. Those people are volunteered to be in the military, and they can also help back at home by working in the factories or making supplies. They had a lot more factories in the North. These factories that had been making most of the country's manufactured goods, like clothes, now they can start making things for the military. So instead of making regular shoes, they start making military boots. Or instead of making things for the railroad, they start making guns or bullets or ammunition. And they also have a lot more railroads in the North. That becomes really important later in the war because they can use it to transport supplies quickly, and the South doesn't have those. And finally, the North has almost the entire United States Navy. Most of the Navy was in control of the North. Most of the naval commanders stay in the North. So the North uses that Navy to their advantage, like we already talked about, with the Anaconda Plan and in trying to gain control of the Mississippi River. Some of the strengths of the South. The South has a very strong motivation. If they lose, they end up losing everything. They were viewed as rebels and traitors, and they weren't really sure how they would be treated if they lost the war. They were able to play just play defense a little bit. In fact, Jefferson Davis says that they're not interested in conquering anything. All the South really wants to do is just be left alone. So it's easy for them to just kind of lay back and wait on the North to come to them. Most of the country's better generals and officers go with the South. This becomes very important because most of the military's strongest leaders work in the Confederate Army. And then most of the war was going to be fought in the South. Now that's kind of a bad thing for the South because it destroys a lot of the things that the country will need. It destroys homes and railroads and farms. But it does an advantage for the South as well because most of what is being fought and most of the battles being fought in the South, those battles are fought closer to their home. They know the terrain, they know the land, and the citizens of the South would help them. Weaknesses of the North, they had to conquer the South. They were going to have to completely conquer and occupy the South in order to make the South come back. Otherwise, they were just going to be left alone and continue acting as if they were their own country. They had fewer qualified officers. Some of the people in the North felt like they should just let the South go.
They felt like maybe the South did have a right to leave the Union, and they didn't want him in the country anyway. So some felt like they should let him go. And not everybody believed slavery was evil. So a lot of the people in the North weren't willing to fight to end slavery. So that's one of the reasons why Lincoln tries to make sure the goal of the war is to keep the Union together and not make it about slavery right away, because he was afraid some of the people in the North didn't want it to be about slavery. Weaknesses of the South, kind of like what we've already talked about: much smaller population, especially free population. They have fewer factories and railroads. The South was having major political problems. When you take a group of states that have rebelled against their government, they're not always real inclined to get along, because those states, remember, they all believed in strong states' rights. At one point, Georgia threatened to secede from the Confederacy. So they were having a tough time getting everybody to get along in the South. They also had a very weakened economy. They were having a tough time trading because of the blockade that we'll talk about in a minute, and they didn't have a lot of manufacturing or anything like that. So the South was having a tough time making money during the war. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. That will wrap us up. You guys have been a wonderful audience. This will conclude today's lecture over the military strategies, strengths, and weaknesses of both the Confederate and Union armies during the Civil War. Be sure to complete the review questions at the end of this. When you are ready to oral defense those questions, you can come up and find me, and you should be able to pass this objective. If you have any questions about it, be sure to see me. I'm sure I can help you with those. Good luck with your assignments, and have a nice day.